The needle moved through silk with surgical precision, each stitch a small victory against the mounting bills scattered across Amara Okafor's cramped workbench. In the basement shop beneath Seoul's forgotten Itaewon district, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, casting harsh shadows across fabric that cost more than most people earned in a month. Her fingers, stained purple from hours of handling dye, guided expensive thread through a tear in what appeared to be a designer jacket worth more than her rent. I wonder where you're watching this from tonight. Are you in a place where dreams feel possible, or somewhere like this basement where survival takes everything you have? Let me know in the comments below, because Amara's story might feel familiar no matter where you are in the world. The calculator on her phone displayed numbers that made her stomach clench. Rent was due in 3 days. The utility company had already sent 2 warnings. Her younger brother Kemi needed new school shoes, the kind that wouldn't mark him as the poor kid from the basement. Again, she pressed her lips together and focused on the delicate work before her, transforming damage into beauty with skills her grandmother had taught her in the dusty streets of Lagos before everything changed. Before the building fell, the memory surfaced like oil on water, dark and impossible to ignore. Her father had been inside that construction site when the walls collapsed, crushed beneath concrete and steel that should have held but didn't. The investigation revealed corruption, substandard materials, and a web of bribes that reached into the highest levels of the construction company. Foreign investors, they said. Korean money funding quick, cheap buildings that killed innocent people like her father, who trusted walls to stand strong. She had been 15 then, suddenly responsible for 12-year-old Kemi with nothing but her sewing skills and a determination that burned brighter than the grief trying to consume her. 5 years of working, saving, and planning had brought them here to Seoul, chasing opportunities and running from memories. The irony of seeking their future in the country whose companies had destroyed their past wasn't lost on her. But survival required practical choices, not philosophical ones. The basement shop was barely 12 feet square, carved out of space that had once been storage for the restaurant above. Moisture stains decorated the concrete walls like abstract art, and the single window faced an alley where stray cats fought over scraps. But the rent was manageable, barely, and the location attracted customers who needed discretion more than luxury. Politicians with torn pockets after difficult meetings. Businessmen whose wives couldn't know about the stains on their expensive shirts. Women whose husbands would ask too many questions about how designer dresses got damaged. Amara understood secrets. She kept them sewn into hems and hidden in linings, never asking questions that might cost her the few clients who could afford her skills. The door chime announced Kemi's return from school, his 16-year-old frame filling the narrow doorway. He moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned early to read dangerous situations, his dark eyes scanning the shop automatically before settling on his sister. "Did you eat lunch today?" she asked without looking up from her work, though she already knew the answer from the way he avoided her gaze. "The cafeteria food is terrible anyway," he replied, dropping his worn backpack beside the sewing machine. His English carried traces of their father's Nigerian accent mixed with the Seoul dialect he had absorbed like a linguistic sponge. "I would rather wait for your cooking." She smiled despite the worry gnawing at her chest. Kemi had always been diplomatic, even as a child, finding ways to make difficult truths sound like preferences rather than necessities. The school lunch program required payment they couldn't afford, but he refused to apply for the free meal program that would mark him as poor among his classmates. "There's rice and chicken in the refrigerator upstairs," she told him, finally setting down her needle to meet his eyes. "Go eat while I finish this piece. Mrs. Chin will pay me tomorrow, and we can go shopping for those shoes you need." His face brightened with carefully controlled hope. "The ones with the good soles that don't slip?" "The very ones," she confirmed, watching relief wash across his features. "And maybe we can even get you that jacket you saw in the store window, the blue one you said looked like something an actor would wear." Kemi's smile was worth every hour she would spend working tonight to make that promise reality. He had given up so much to follow her dream of building something better in this foreign city. New shoes and a jacket seemed like small compensation for his sacrifices, but they were symbols of progress, proof that their struggles had meaning beyond mere survival. After he disappeared upstairs to their tiny apartment above the shop, Amara returned to her work with renewed focus. The jacket in her hands belonged to someone wealthy enough to afford custom repairs rather than simple replacement. The fabric was impossibly soft, woven with threads that caught light like captured starlight. Each stitch had to be perfect, invisible, as if the damage had never existed. She understood the appeal of such erasure, the desire to make wounds disappear without trace. Her own scars ran deeper than any needle could reach, carved by loss and hardship into patterns that shaped every decision. But unlike fabric, human hearts couldn't be repaired with thread and patience. Some damage became part of the design, changing the structure without destroying the beauty. The clock above her workbench ticked past midnight as she completed the final stitches, transforming torn silk into seamless perfection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new bills, new worries about Kemi's future, and whether their dreams were strong enough to survive another month in this expensive city. But tonight, in the warm glow of her work lamp, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the evidence of her skill, Amara allowed herself a moment of pride. She was building something here, stitch by careful stitch. Not just a business, but a life worth living, a future worth fighting for. And if that future required her to mend the expensive clothes of Seoul's elite while living in a basement, then she would do it with the grace and dignity her grandmother had taught her. After all, the most beautiful fabrics often came from the humblest beginnings. The crash against her shop door shattered the peaceful silence of 3 in the morning like glass against concrete. Amara's head snapped up from the evening gown she was hemming, her heart hammering against her ribs as shadows moved beyond the frosted glass. Living in this part of Seoul had taught her to recognize different types of danger by sound alone. Drunk college students stumbled and laughed. Police sirens wailed with official authority. Gang members moved with purposeful silence. This was something else entirely. The door handle rattled violently before the entire frame shook under the impact of someone's weight. A man's voice, speaking rapid Korean punctuated by what sounded like curses or prayers, filtered through the thin walls. Amara's fingers found her phone, thumb hovering over the emergency number while her eyes searched for the back exit that led to the alley behind her building. Then she heard something that made her freeze completely. The soft, desperate sound of someone in genuine pain, the kind that stripped away pretense and left only raw human need. Her grandmother's voice echoed across the years, reminding her that mercy was not about deserving, but about choosing to see suffering and respond with compassion. Against every instinct screaming for self-preservation, Amara moved toward the door. The man who nearly fell into her shop when she turned the lock was nothing like the customers who usually sought her services. Tall and lean with sharp features that spoke of good breeding and expensive education, he wore a suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. But the elegant black fabric was torn across the shoulder and stained with something dark that could only be blood. His breathing came in short, controlled gasps that suggested broken ribs, or worse. Most unsettling of all were his eyes. Dark and intelligent, they assessed her and the shop with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities in seconds. This was not a man who stumbled into random basements by accident. "I need help," he said in accented English, his voice carrying the refined tones of someone educated in international schools. His Korean was probably perfect, but he had chosen to speak her language, recognizing something in her face or surroundings that marked her as foreign. "My apologies for the intrusion." The formal politeness would have been amusing under different circumstances. Here was a man bleeding onto her floor, speaking as if he had arrived for afternoon tea rather than crashing through her door like a wounded animal seeking shelter. "You need a hospital," she replied, though her professional eye was already cataloging the damage to his clothing with the automatic assessment that came from years of repair work. The tear ran from his left shoulder to mid-chest, clean edges suggesting a knife rather than accident. The blood appeared to be from a shallow cut rather than anything life-threatening, but his careful movement indicated other injuries hidden beneath the expensive fabric. "No hospitals," he said firmly, a flash of something dangerous crossing his features. "Too many questions. Too many people who would be very interested in my location tonight." Amara felt her throat tighten. Whatever had happened to this man involved the kind of people who made others disappear for asking the wrong questions. Every rational part of her mind insisted she send him away, lock the door, and pretend this encounter had never happened. Kimmy slept upstairs, trusting her to keep them both safe from the dangerous currents that ran beneath Sol's glittering surface. But her hands were already moving, professional instincts overriding personal fear as she gestured toward the single chair beside her workbench. The suit could be saved with careful work. The fabric was too beautiful to sacrifice to violence and poor decisions. Sit down before you fall down, she instructed, her grandmother's no-nonsense tone emerging without conscious thought. Let me see what we're dealing with. He followed her direction with the careful obedience of someone accustomed to following orders when they made tactical sense. Up close, she could see that he was younger than his bearing suggested, probably not much older than her own 25 years. Pain had carved temporary lines around his eyes, but underneath lay the bone-deep confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt his place in the world. The suit jacket came off with minimal protest, revealing a white dress shirt that told a clearer story of whatever violence had found him tonight. More tears, more blood, and bruising that was already beginning to darken across his ribs. Whoever had done this had been thorough, but not particularly skilled. Or perhaps they had been interrupted before finishing their work. "What's your name?" she asked while examining the damaged fabric, partly from curiosity and partly to keep him talking while she worked. People in shock sometimes stopped breathing if they got too quiet. "Minjae," he replied after a pause that suggested he was considering whether truth or lies served his interests better. Minjae General, the surname, meant nothing to her, though something in the way he said it suggested it should. Important families often carried their power in their names like jewelry, visible symbols of influence and connection. But Amara's world operated outside those circles of privilege, focused on the more immediate concerns of rent and rice, and keeping her brother safe. "Amara," she offered in return, settling into the familiar rhythm of assessment and repair that had sustained her through 5 years of building this small business. "Amara Okafor." "Nigerian," he observed, not a question but a statement that revealed more familiarity with African surnames than most Koreans possessed. "By way of Lagos," she confirmed, beginning to carefully separate the torn edges of silk to understand the full extent of damage. The fabric was exceptional quality, woven with threads that seemed to capture and reflect light like trapped starfire. European design, probably Italian, custom-tailored to fit his exact measurements. "And you are Korean by way of somewhere with very good schools and very bad enemies." His laugh was short and sharp, cut off quickly as if the movement hurt. "You have an interesting way of assessing situations." "I work with fabric," she replied, beginning the delicate process of cleaning blood from silk without damaging the weave. "Fabric tells stories about the people who wear it, where they go, what they do, how they live. Your suit says you attend important meetings in expensive places. The damage says tonight did not go according to plan." "No," he agreed quietly, watching her hands move with the practiced efficiency of years spent turning chaos into order. "Tonight did not go according to plan at all." They fell into companionable silence while she worked, the soft sound of careful stitching punctuating the early morning quiet. Outside, Seoul continued its relentless pace even at this hour, delivery trucks rumbling past, and early shift workers beginning their commutes. But inside her small shop, time seemed suspended, reduced to the ancient rhythm of needle and thread transforming damage into wholeness. Minjae watched her work with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. There was respect in his gaze, recognition of skill and artistry that transcended the desperate circumstances that had brought him to her door. When she finally set down her needle and held up the repaired jacket, the tear had vanished completely, invisible even under direct light. "How much?" he asked, reaching for what appeared to be a very expensive wallet. "Nothing," she replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "It's 3 in the morning, you're bleeding, and you needed help. That's not a business transaction." He stared at her for a long moment, clearly unfamiliar with the concept of services rendered without expectation of payment. In his world, she realized, everything had a price, and every favor created debt. The idea of simple kindness seemed to puzzle him more than the violence that had driven him to seek shelter in her shop. "Everything has a price," he said finally, confirming her assessment. "Not everything," she replied, helping him back into the repaired jacket. Some things you do because they're right, not because they're profitable. Min-jae stood carefully, testing his movement and finding the jacket fit perfectly despite the extensive repairs. For a moment, she thought he might argue, might insist on forcing payment that would turn kindness into transaction. Instead, he moved toward the door with the same careful grace that had marked his arrival. At the threshold, he turned back to face her, and she caught another glimpse of those intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything for future reference. Amara Okafor, he said, as if committing the name to memory for reasons she couldn't fathom. Thank you. And then he was gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn's soul morning like a well-dressed ghost, leaving only questions and the faint scent of expensive cologne mixed with danger. Amara locked the door behind him and returned to her workbench, but concentration proved impossible. Her hands shook slightly as she realized what she had done, how easily she had opened her door to a man who carried violence like a second skin. But she had seen something else in those dark eyes during the quiet moments while she worked. Something that looked almost like loneliness, like a man who had forgotten what kindness felt like until a stranger offered it without conditions or expectations. She wondered, as she finally turned off the lights and headed upstairs to snatch a few hours of sleep before Kimmy woke for school, whether she would ever see the mysterious Min-jae Jin again. And despite every rational argument her mind constructed about danger and wisdom and keeping safe distance from whatever world had marked him for violence, she discovered that part of her hoped the answer was yes. 3 days passed before Min-jae returned, appearing at her door during the early afternoon lull when most of Seoul was either working or sleeping off lunch. This time he knocked rather than crashed, and when Amara opened the door, he stood straight and uninjured, holding a garment bag with the reverent care usually reserved for religious artifacts. I have something that requires your particular expertise, he announced, as if their previous encounter had been a formal business introduction rather than a midly-off-the-night emergency. The formality felt like armor, she realized, protection against the vulnerability that kindness had exposed. She gestured him inside, noting how his eyes automatically swept the shop's corners and exits before settling on her face. Whatever world he inhabited had trained him to assess threats even in a basement tailor shop run by a woman who barely reached his shoulder. The garment bag contained what appeared to be a vintage Korean silk vest, the kind worn with traditional formal wear during important ceremonies. But this piece was extraordinary, hand-embroidered with golden threads that formed intricate dragons chasing clouds across midnight blue fabric. The workmanship spoke of master artisans and historical significance, the sort of piece that belonged in museums rather than everyday wardrobes. The problem was immediately obvious. Someone had attempted to clean a stain using harsh chemicals, creating a pale blotch that had destroyed both the silk's natural sheen and several of the golden threads. Amateur restoration had only made things worse, leaving the piece damaged in ways that would require weeks of careful work to repair properly. This belonged to my grandfather, Min-jae explained, his voice carrying emotions carefully held in check. He wore it when he signed the papers that established our family's first legitimate business. My father wants to wear it at an important ceremony next month, but as you can see, previous attempts at restoration were unsuccessful. Amara examined the damage more closely, already calculating the time and materials needed to restore such a piece to its original glory. The work would require specialty threads, probably custom-dyed to match the original colors exactly. Historical textile restoration was more art than science, demanding not just technical skill but deep understanding of traditional techniques and materials. This will take at least 3 weeks, she told him honestly, and the materials alone will cost more than most people spend on clothing in a year. You could probably find museum conservators who specialize in this type of work. I could, he agreed, but museum conservators ask questions about provenance and historical significance. They want documentation and insurance papers and investigations into how such pieces ended up in private collections. You, I suspect, simply want to restore something beautiful to its proper condition. She understood the unspoken subtext. Whatever his family's history with this vest, it probably wouldn't survive academic scrutiny. Like many Asian families who had navigated the tumultuous 20th century, the Jin clan had likely acquired and preserve treasures through methods that wouldn't pass modern ethical standards. 3 weeks, she confirmed, already mentally rearranging her schedule to accommodate the intensive work required. And payment up front for materials. He produced an envelope thick enough to cover materials and several months of her regular income, placing it on her workbench without ceremony. The casual way he handled such amounts reinforced her growing understanding that money represented convenience rather than constraint in his world. Their second meeting followed the pattern of the first, professional courtesy masking mutual curiosity. But when he returned 4 days later with a designer shirt that had somehow acquired a wine-stained shape like modern art, the conversation shifted into more personal territory. "You have steady hands," he observed while watching her work on the intricate embroidery restoration. "Most people would shake under such pressure." "Pressure is relative," she replied, her fingers moving in the meditative rhythm that years of practice had perfected. "My grandmother always said that steady hands come from a steady heart. When you know your purpose, external circumstances become less important." "And what is your purpose?" he asked, the question carrying genuine curiosity rather than polite small talk. "To build something lasting," she answered after considering whether honesty or discretion served her better with this complicated man. "My brother and I came here to create opportunities that didn't exist for us back home. Every piece I restore, every garment I repair, brings us closer to that goal." She gestured around the small shop, taking in the concrete walls and fluorescent lighting that marked it as far from glamorous. "But someday this will be a proper atelier, with apprentices and regular clients and a reputation for excellence that extends beyond Seoul. Kimmy will graduate from university, become an engineer like our father wanted to be before circumstances demanded different choices." Min-jae listened with the focused attention of someone unaccustomed to hearing dreams expressed without apology or embarrassment. His world, she suspected, dealt in accomplished facts rather than hopeful possibilities. "Your brother is fortunate to have such dedication," he commented, as if summoned by mention of his name. Kimmy chose that moment to arrive home from school, his lanky frame filling the doorway as he processed the scene of his sister working while an expensively dressed stranger observed. His expression shifted through wariness, curiosity, and finally polite acknowledgement as social training overcame protective instincts. "Kimmy, this is Mr. Jin," Amara introduced them, noting how Min-jae rose from his chair with the automatic respect her brother's presence commanded. "He brought some work that requires my special attention." The teenager's handshake was firm and direct, his English carefully formal as he replied that it was nice to meet him. But his eyes remained alert, reading the stranger's body language with the survival skills that life had taught him early. Growing up responsible for each other had made both siblings expert at assessing whether new people represented opportunity or threat. "What grade are you in school?" Min-jae asked, and Amara was surprised by the genuine interest in his voice. 11th grade, Kimmy replied, relaxing slightly when he realized the question came from curiosity rather than condescension. "I want to study structural engineering at Seoul National University." "That's ambitious," Min-jae commented, but his tone suggested approval rather than skepticism. "Engineering is excellent preparation for understanding how things are built to last." "Like my sister's work," Kimmy agreed, pride evident despite his typical teenage reluctance to praise family members directly. "She can fix anything, make it better than it was before the damage happened." The conversation that followed revealed Min-jae's unexpected knowledge of construction techniques and his genuine respect for craftsmanship in all its forms. He spoke about restoration projects his family had undertaken, preserving historical buildings while adapting them for modern use. His questions about Kimmy's studies were informed and encouraging, treating the teenager as someone whose opinions mattered rather than a child to be indulged. When Min-jae finally left that afternoon, Kimmy helped his sister clean up the workspace, his usual post-school routine that had become their quiet time for processing the day's events. "He's different from your usual customers," Kimmy observed while organizing spools of thread by color and weight. "Different how?" Amara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "He listened when I talked about engineering, really listened, like my ideas were worth his time. Most adults pretend to be interested, but you can tell they're just being polite. And he knows things, not just about expensive clothes, but about how buildings work and why restoration matters." She had noticed the same thing, the way Min-jae engaged with concepts rather than dismissing them, the respect he showed for expertise regardless of its source. Dangerous men, in her limited experience, usually relied on intimidation rather than intelligence to get their way. This man was clearly dangerous, but his weapons appeared to be curiosity and competence rather than violence and fear. Over the following weeks, Min-jae's visits became regular fixtures in their routine, always arriving with some garment that required her particular combination of skill and discretion. A dinner jacket with mysterious burn marks that spoke of close encounters with fire. A pair of formal trousers that had been torn during what appeared to be a very physical disagreement. Shirts that carried stains suggesting their owner spent time in places where blood and other bodily fluids were occupational hazards. She never asked direct questions about the circumstances that created such damage, and he never offered explanations that might implicate her in knowledge she was better off not possessing. But gradually, through careful conversation and shared observations, they began to understand each other in ways that transcended their obvious differences in background and circumstance. He spoke about family obligations that felt more like prison sentences, expectations that allowed no room for personal preference or individual growth. She talked about the weight of responsibility for her brother's future and the constant pressure of building dreams in a foreign country with limited resources and infinite determination. They discovered shared appreciation for old movies, particularly American films from the 1940s that portrayed complicated characters making difficult choices in morally ambiguous situations. Both had learned early that life rarely offered clear distinctions between right and wrong, that survival often required compromises that books and movies never adequately explained. Most importantly, they found in each other someone who understood what it meant to carry the hopes and fears of family members who depended on decisions made under pressure. Min-jae's choices affected not just himself, but an extended network of people whose livelihoods connected to his family's enterprises. Amara's decisions shaped not just her own future, but Kemi's opportunities and their ability to honor their father's memory through achievements he would have celebrated. The attraction that grew between them during those weeks felt inevitable and impossible in equal measure. Inevitable because compatibility of mind and spirit created connection that neither wealth nor danger could completely overshadow. Impossible because their worlds operated according to different rules, and crossing such boundaries carried consequences that extended far beyond personal desire. But attraction, Amara discovered, had little respect for practicality or common sense. When Min-jae smiled at something Kemi said, or when his fingers brushed hers while examining fabric, or when he listened to her dreams with the focused attention of someone who believed they might actually come true, she felt herself falling towards something that promised either salvation or destruction. And based on the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, she suspected he was falling too. The evening that changed everything began with rain drumming against the small window above Amara's workbench. Seoul's autumn weather turning the alley outside into a river of reflected neon light. Min-jae had arrived earlier than usual, carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than her monthly grocery budget and wearing an expression that suggested celebration mixed with something deeper and more complex. The traditional vest was finally complete, restored to glory that surpassed even its original condition. Golden dragons danced across midnight silk with renewed fire, each thread precisely matched to the historical specifications that had taken weeks of research to verify. Amara had found deep satisfaction in the meticulous work, knowing that she had preserved something beautiful for future generations while proving her skills worthy of the most challenging restoration projects. "My father will be speechless," Min-jae said while examining the finished piece under her work lamp, his voice carrying emotions carefully controlled but not entirely hidden. This was his father's most treasured possession, and he had given up hope of seeing it properly restored. They shared the expensive wine from coffee mugs, the only glasses appropriate for such an informal celebration in her humble workspace. The alcohol loosened tongues that had grown comfortable with careful conversation, and for the first time since their strange relationship began, Min-jae spoke openly about the family expectations that shaped every aspect of his existence. "I never chose this life," he admitted, staring into his wine as if answers might materialize in its dark surface. When I was young, I wanted to be an architect, to design buildings that would stand for centuries and house families safely. My grandfather laughed at such foolish dreams, told me that Jin men were born to lead, not to draw pictures of imaginary structures. The irony was sharp enough to cut. Here was a man forced into criminal enterprises when his heart belonged to creation and preservation, while she had been driven from her homeland by the collapse of a building that should have stood strong. Their conversation had often touched on construction and engineering, subjects that engaged his genuine passion despite their connection to painful family history. "What kind of leadership does your family require?" she asked, though part of her already suspected answers that would complicate everything she was beginning to feel for this complicated man. "The kind that builds empires through methods that architects never learn in university," he replied with bitter humor. "Construction projects that prioritize profit margins over safety regulations. Real estate development that displaces communities rather than serving them. Business relationships maintained through intimidation rather than mutual respect." Each confession hit like a physical blow, connecting dots that Amara had refused to acknowledge during the weeks of growing attraction and deepening connection. His family's wealth came from the same industry that had killed her father, built through the same corner-cutting corruption that left families destroyed and communities devastated. She excused herself to use the small bathroom behind her workspace, ostensibly to splash cold water on her face, but really to access her phone and the internet research she should have conducted weeks ago. The Jin family name, when combined with Seoul construction companies and Nigerian building projects, yielded results that made her hands shake and her stomach clench with sick recognition. There it was, buried in financial reports and investigative journalism from 5 years past. Jin Construction International, a subsidiary of the Jin family's legitimate business empire, had been the primary contractor for the Lagos residential development where her father died. The investigation had revealed substandard concrete, inadequate steel reinforcement, and a web of bribes that reached from Nigerian officials to Korean executives who prioritized profit over human life. Her father's name appeared on the victim list, identified as a maintenance supervisor who had been inspecting structural integrity when the walls collapsed. The same walls that should have been built with materials strong enough to protect the families who trusted their homes to stand firm against time and weather. When she returned to her workbench, Min-jae was examining photographs she kept on the small shelf beside her sewing machine. Pictures of her father in his work clothes, smiling beside partially constructed buildings that represented hope and progress for Lagos families seeking decent housing. Pictures of their small family before death shattered it into fragments that still hadn't properly healed. "Your father was a builder," he observed, and there was genuine respect in his voice as he studied the images of a man he would never meet. "He was," she replied, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest like steam in a pressure cooker. "He believed that good construction could change lives, that families deserved homes built to last rather than homes built to generate maximum profit for foreign investors." The words hung between them like smoke, carrying implications that couldn't be ignored or misinterpreted. Min-jae's expression shifted from curiosity to understanding to something that looked like dawning horror as connections formed in his mind with the same terrible clarity they had achieved in hers. "Where did he die?" Min-jae asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already suspected answers that would destroy everything they had built together over these weeks of careful courtship and growing trust. "Lagos," she replied, meeting his eyes directly and watching recognition bloom like a poisonous flower across his features. "In a residential building constructed by Jin Construction International. When walls built with substandard materials collapsed because Korean executives decided that Nigerian lives were worth less than profit margins." The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, suspended time before devastation struck with full force. Min-jae set down his wine and moved toward her with the careful approach of someone seeking forgiveness for unforgivable sins, but she stepped back, needing distance to process betrayal that cut deeper than simple deception. "Amara, I swear to you, I had no knowledge of specific projects or individual victims. I was 20 years old and still in university when those contracts were signed. My involvement in family business came later, after graduation, when refusing inheritance was no longer an option. His explanations sounded reasonable, logical, the kind of mitigation that courts considered when assigning guilt and innocence to complex situations involving corporate negligence and family obligations. But reason held no power against the image of her father crushed beneath concrete that should have protected rather than destroyed, killed by greed that wore expensive suits and spoke in boardrooms rather than carrying weapons in dark alleys. "You profited from his death," she said, each word falling like stones into still water, creating ripples that expanded toward conclusions neither of them could avoid. "Every expensive suit I've repaired, every meal you've shared with my brother, every moment of connection between us has been funded by blood money extracted from families like mine." "That's not," he began, then stopped, recognizing that denial served no purpose when facts spoke with absolute clarity. "You're right," he said instead, the simple acknowledgement carrying more weight than elaborate justifications could have managed. "My family's wealth includes profits from projects that killed innocent people, including your father." She wanted him to fight her accusations, to provide explanations that would allow their relationship to survive this revelation. Instead, his acceptance of responsibility made everything worse, confirming that the man she was falling in love with carried complicity in the tragedy that had shaped her entire adult life. The practical part of her mind, the part trained by years of survival in difficult circumstances, recognized that Min-jae personally bore no direct responsibility for decisions made by previous generations. But the daughter who still grieved her father's unnecessary death couldn't separate individual guilt from collective accountability, couldn't love someone whose family fortune was built on foundations that included her father's grave. "I think you should leave," she said finally, her voice carrying finality that allowed no room for negotiation or compromise. "And I think you should not come back." Min-jae stood slowly, moving with the careful precision of someone absorbing physical injury. His eyes held pain that looked genuine, but Amara had learned early that wealthy men were skilled at performing emotions that served their interests. Whether his suffering was authentic or calculated, it couldn't bridge the gap that truth had opened between them. "If there were any way to undo the past, to bring back your father and every other person harmed by my family's choices," he said while putting on the jacket she had repaired after their first violent meeting, "I would sacrifice everything we own and everything we are to make that possible." "But you can't," she replied, her grandmother's steel entering her voice as survival instincts overrode the part of her heart that wanted to forgive, because forgiveness felt easier than justice. "So please leave, and let us both remember these weeks as a mistake that won't be repeated." He moved toward the door with the measured steps of someone carrying tremendous weight, pausing only to place an envelope on her workbench that probably contained payment for the vest restoration. Money that would help with Kimmy's education and their daily expenses, even if its source now carried associations that would haunt every purchase. "I'm sorry, Amara," he said without turning back to meet her eyes. Sorrier than words can express for things that can never be fixed or forgiven. After he left, she locked the door and sat among her fabrics and tools, surrounded by the evidence of skills that had brought them together and truths that had torn them apart. The rain continued drumming against her window, washing Seoul's streets clean while her heart processed betrayal that felt both personal and universal. She had fallen in love with a man whose family had murdered her father through negligence disguised as business efficiency. The situation would have been simpler if Min-jae had been obviously evil, clearly unworthy of affection or respect. Instead, he was exactly the kind of person she could have built a life with, if circumstances had been different, if history had been kinder, if love could exist independent of justice. But love, she was learning, required more than compatibility and attraction. It demanded the ability to trust completely, to build futures on foundations strong enough to bear the weight of shared dreams. And some foundations, once cracked by truth, could never be repaired sufficiently to support the structures built upon them. The expensive wine sat unfinished in coffee mugs that would remind her of this evening every time she used them for their intended purpose. Outside, Seoul continued its relentless pace. Millions of people navigating relationships and responsibilities that didn't involve such impossible choices between heart and history. But inside her small shop, Surrounded by the tools of restoration and repair, Amara finally understood that some damage ran too deep for any thread to mend, some wounds too wide for any skill to close. She would continue building her life and her brother's future, but she would do it without the dangerous comfort of loving someone whose very existence reminded her that some losses could never be made whole. The first warning came 3 days after she had sent Min-jae away, delivered in the form of spray paint across her shop window that spelled out messages in Korean characters she couldn't read, but understood perfectly through their violent red color and aggressive lettering. Her upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Kim, translated with obvious reluctance and growing concern as she realized the implications. "Foreign whore who doesn't know her place," the elderly woman read, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. "Stay away from what doesn't belong to you, or learn why smart girls keep quiet." Amara photographed the vandalism before cleaning it away, documenting evidence while her mind raced through possibilities and consequences that made her stomach clench with familiar fear. Someone had been watching her shop, monitoring her interactions, building profiles that connected her to Min-jae despite their relationship's recent termination. Whoever had sent this message possessed information that reached beyond casual observation into detailed surveillance. The second warning arrived through Kemi, who came home from school with bruises on his wrists and an expression that combined adolescent embarrassment with genuine terror. He had been approached by older students who knew details about his sister's business and foreign connections, information they shouldn't have possessed unless someone had been asking very specific questions about the Jin family's recent activities. "They said you've been causing problems for important people," Kemi reported while she examined purple finger marks that suggested he had been grabbed with significant force. "They said smart families know how to keep their women under control, and maybe you needed lessons about respecting boundaries." The implications made her blood run cold with recognition of dangers she had hoped to avoid by ending things with Min-jae before deeper complications arose. But apparently complications had already embedded themselves into her life through connections that existed independent of her personal choices. Someone wanted to send messages through intimidation and violence, treating her family as acceptable collateral damage in conflicts she didn't understand. That evening, she locked the shop early and spent hours researching security options that balanced protection with their limited budget. Cameras, better locks, emergency contacts with local police who might respond quickly if situations escalated beyond intimidation into direct threats. But she knew that people wealthy enough to command teenage enforcers possessed resources that made physical security largely symbolic rather than practically effective. The third escalation came through her brother's school, where officials called to report that Kemi had been involved in an incident requiring immediate parental intervention. When she arrived, she found him sitting in the principal's office with a split lip and torn uniform, surrounded by adults whose expressions combined concern with barely concealed frustration at dealing with problems that extended beyond normal academic discipline. 3 senior students had cornered him in the bathroom, demanding information about his sister's recent customers and specifically her relationship with certain well-connected families. When Kemi refused to discuss private business matters, the conversation had become physical until teachers intervened and separated the participants. The principal, a tired-looking man who had probably dealt with similar situations involving organized crime families and their extended networks, suggested that perhaps transferring Kemi to a different school might serve everyone's best interests. His tone carried sympathy mixed with practical recognition that some problems couldn't be solved through detention and parent conferences. "We haven't done anything wrong," Amara insisted, though she recognized how naive that sounded in circumstances where right and wrong held less importance than power and connections. "My brother shouldn't have to change schools because other people have decided to involve children in adult conflicts." The principal nodded with weary understanding while reviewing paperwork that probably contained details about previous situations where innocent families had been caught between competing criminal interests. Sometimes doing nothing wrong isn't enough protection against people who operate outside normal social boundaries, he replied with gentle honesty that acknowledged realities she was still learning to navigate. That night, while Kemi slept with a chair wedged under his bedroom door, Amara sat in her shop surrounded by expensive fabrics and restoration projects that now felt like evidence of poor decisions rather than professional accomplishments. The telephone rang at 2 in the morning, and she answered despite knowing that good news never arrived at such hours. The voice spoke Korean, then switched to accented English when she failed to respond appropriately. "You have something that belongs to people who don't like sharing." The male caller informed her with conversational casualness that made the threat feel more rather than less dangerous. Smart girls return what they took and apologize for the misunderstanding. "I don't have anything that belongs to anyone else," she replied, though she suspected this conversation had less to do with actual theft than with symbolic possession and territorial disputes between criminal organizations she didn't understand. "Then perhaps you should ask your friend about sharing information that creates problems for his family's business relationships," the caller suggested before disconnecting, leaving her alone with dial tone and implications that made sleep impossible for the remainder of the night. By morning, she had reached the conclusion that Min Jae needed to know about escalating threats even if their personal relationship remained terminated. Whatever conflicts existed within Seoul's criminal hierarchy, she and Kimmy had become unwilling participants through association rather than choice. Basic survival required understanding the rules of engagement for games they had never agreed to play. She found his business card tucked between pages of the appointment book where she tracked client schedules and payment arrangements. The number connected to an automated system that eventually transferred her call to an assistant who spoke perfect English and promised that Mr. Jin would return her message as soon as possible. He appeared at her shop within an hour, arriving with 2 men who remained outside while he entered alone. His expression carried controlled fury that reminded her of the dangerous stranger who had crashed through her door weeks earlier, all careful politeness stripped away to reveal something predatory and protective in equal measure. "Tell me exactly what happened," he commanded, his voice carrying authority that expected immediate compliance rather than polite conversation. She described the vandalism, the threats against Kimmy, the phone call that had robbed her of sleep and peace of mind. With each detail, his expression grew darker, hands clenching into fists that spoke of violence barely restrained by tactical considerations. When she finished, he was quiet for several minutes, processing information and calculating responses that probably involved methods she preferred not to understand. "This is my uncle's work," he finally explained, the words carrying years of family conflict and bitter disappointment. He believes that outsiders who gain access to family members represent security risks that must be eliminated before they cause larger problems. "Your relationship with me, however brief, marked you as someone who knows too much about our private business." The explanation felt both logical and insane, criminally disproportionate response to what had been essentially a romantic relationship between consenting adults. But logic, she was learning, held limited power in situations where perception mattered more than truth and where eliminating perceived threats took precedence over distinguishing actual dangers from imaginary ones. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, recognizing that flight or fight represented her only realistic options in circumstances where appeasing his uncle seemed neither possible nor advisable. "Nothing," Min Jae replied with finality that suggested decisions made rather than options being considered. "This isn't your responsibility to resolve, and it isn't your family's burden to carry. I will handle my uncle and the problems his paranoia has created." She wanted to ask about methods and timelines and safety guarantees that would protect Kimmy from retaliation during whatever resolution Min Jae planned to implement. But his expression discouraged questions that might force him to share information she was better off not possessing, especially if future legal proceedings required her testimony about events she had witnessed rather than participated in directly. 2 days later, Seoul's financial newspapers carried headlines about arrests and investigations that sent shockwaves through the city's business community. The Jin family's construction empire, built over 3 generations of strategic partnerships and political connections, collapsed in a matter of hours as police executed simultaneous raids on corporate offices and private residences. The key breakthrough came from an insider who provided evidence of corruption, money laundering, and criminal negligence that spanned decades of projects both domestic and international. Bank records, construction documents, and recorded conversations that painted detailed pictures of systematic corner-cutting and deliberate endangerment of public safety for profit maximization. Min-jae's photograph appeared on front pages alongside headlines that identified him as the whistleblower whose testimony had enabled prosecutors to build cases against his own family members. His uncle, father, and several cousins faced charges that carried potential sentences measured in decades rather than years, while their business empire underwent complete dissolution and asset forfeiture. The evening those stories broke, he returned to her shop carrying a resignation letter from his position with the family corporation and documentation showing that he had voluntarily surrendered his inheritance rights in favor of victim compensation funds. Everything he had been raised to inherit, every source of wealth and status that had defined his identity since birth, had been sacrificed to ensure that families like hers received justice for decades of exploitation and negligence. "I can't undo what my family did to yours," he told her while standing in the same spot where their relationship had ended days earlier. "But I can make sure they never hurt anyone else the same way, and I can ensure that every family affected by our crimes receives compensation they should have gotten years ago." The gesture was enormous, the kind of sacrifice that movies portrayed but real life rarely provided. A man choosing justice over inheritance, choosing strangers' welfare over family loyalty, choosing principle over comfort and security. But gestures, however dramatic, couldn't erase history or resurrect fathers who had died because of decisions his family had made long before they met. "Why?" she asked, needing to understand motivations that seemed to transcend guilt or love or any combination of emotions that might drive such dramatic action. "Because some things matter more than money or family expectations or personal comfort," he replied, his voice carrying conviction that sounded genuine rather than performed. "Because the alternative is spending the rest of my life knowing that I chose complicity over courage, that I prioritized my own convenience over justice for people who deserved better." The threats against her family evaporated along with his uncle's freedom and influence, Seoul's criminal hierarchy reorganizing itself around new power structures that had no interest in pursuing vendettas initiated by imprisoned predecessors. But Min-jae's sacrifice created different complications, emotional debts that couldn't be resolved through gratitude or forgiveness alone. She had sent away a wealthy crime family heir whose love came with unacceptable moral compromises. Now she faced a different man entirely, one who had chosen justice over everything else, but whose gesture demanded responses she wasn't prepared to provide. Love built on sacrifice carried its own dangers, expectations and obligations that might prove as challenging as the criminal legacy he had abandoned. Standing in her small shop, surrounded by tools of restoration and repair, Amara realized that some choices created new problems rather than solving existing ones. Min-jae had destroyed his family's empire to protect hers, but whether that sacrifice created foundation for rebuilding their relationship or simply transferred guilt from one direction to another remained a question that only time could answer. 6 months after the headlines faded and the trials concluded with convictions that sent Min-jae's uncle and father to prison for decades, Seoul's winter gave way to spring with the gradual warmth that promised new beginnings for those brave enough to plant seeds in uncertain ground. The Victim Compensation Fund, built from seized Gen family assets, had distributed payments to families across 3 countries whose loved ones had suffered from decades of criminal negligence disguised as business efficiency. Amara received notification that her father's death had been officially recognized as corporate homicide, and that she was entitled to compensation that included full university funding for Kemi plus additional amounts that would transform their basement existence into something resembling the middle-class stability her father had worked to provide. Justice delayed wasn't justice denied, the letter explained, though no amount of money could restore what corruption had stolen from their family. She was reading that letter for the 3rd time when Min-jae knocked on her door, carrying himself with the careful dignity of someone learning to navigate the world without inherited wealth or family connections to smooth his path. 6 months of legitimate work as a construction safety consultant had changed him, replacing the polished edges of privilege with something more substantial and authentic. His hands showed calluses from honest labor, and his clothes, while well-made, carried the practical simplicity of someone who earned rather than inherited his possessions. "The compensation fund has been fully distributed," he reported, his voice carrying satisfaction, mixed with the exhaustion that came from months spent providing testimony and documentation to ensure that every affected family received appropriate recognition and support. Every victim has been identified and contacted, every payment calculated based on actual damages rather than bureaucratic convenience. She gestured him inside, noting how he moved through her space with familiarity tempered by respect, no longer assuming welcome but hoping for acceptance. Their relationship during these months had existed in careful suspension, neither friendship nor romance, but something more complex that acknowledged shared history while avoiding assumptions about shared futures. "What will you do now?" she asked, genuinely curious about how someone rebuilt identity after destroying everything that had previously defined their place in the world. "I've been thinking about architecture again," he replied, settling into the chair beside her workbench that had become his customary spot during their conversations about practical matters and emotional complexity. Not designing buildings, necessarily, but restoration work that preserves what should be saved while adapting structures for modern safety requirements. Making sure that what happened to your father never happens to anyone else. The irony was less sharp now, softened by months of watching him choose accountability over convenience at every decision point. His expertise in construction combined with intimate knowledge of how corners got cut for profit had made him valuable to investigators and safety regulators who needed insider perspective to prevent future tragedies. "That sounds like work that would honor my father's memory," she admitted, recognizing how his genuine commitment to protecting other families had slowly eroded her anger into something more complex that included respect alongside lingering grief. "There's something else I've been considering," he continued, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone presenting ideas without demanding immediate responses. "Something that would combine your skills with the resources I can access through legitimate means now." He outlined a proposal that had been developing during their months of careful friendship, a vision that took her basement shop and expanded it into something that could serve Seoul's growing immigrant community while providing sustainable income for everyone involved. A tailoring academy that would teach newcomers not just sewing skills but business development, customer service, and financial management necessary to build independent enterprises in a foreign country. The space would include workshops for different skill levels, from basic alterations to advanced restoration work like the projects that had brought them together. Students could learn while earning, working on real client projects that paid fair wages while building portfolios and references necessary for establishing their own businesses. The academy would also provide connections to suppliers, legal assistance for business registration, and ongoing mentorship to ensure graduates succeeded rather than simply completed training programs. Most importantly, the academy would operate as cooperative rather than traditional business, with graduates becoming partners rather than employees, sharing both profits and decision-making responsibilities in ways that honored immigrant experiences and cultural backgrounds rather than demanding assimilation to existing structures. "You're describing my grandmother's dream," Amara said softly, remembering stories about collective workshops where women shared skills, resources, and support systems that enabled entire communities to prosper rather than compete. She always said that individual success meant nothing if your community remained vulnerable. The financial backing would come from Minjae's legitimate consulting work combined with grants available for immigrant support programs and skills training initiatives. The building he had identified was a former textile factory in an area experiencing gentrification, large enough to accommodate workshops, classroom space, and small retail area where academy graduates could display and sell their work. What he wasn't saying directly, but what she understood through subtext and careful observation, was that this proposal represented his attempt to build something together that could honor both their commitments to service while creating foundation for personal relationship that transcended guilt and gratitude. Not love built on sacrifice or obligation, but partnership founded on shared values and mutual respect for each other's strengths and experiences. Kimmy had opinions, naturally, which he shared with typical teenage directness once Minjae had left and they could process the proposal in private. His response surprised her with its immediate enthusiasm and practical insights that revealed how carefully he had been observing both Minjae's transformation and his sister's gradual softening towards someone who had chosen justice over comfort repeatedly. He's different now, Kimmy pointed out while helping her organize fabric samples that potential Academy donors wanted to examine. Before, he was someone with money who bought his way through problems. Now he's someone with skills who works to solve problems. And he listens to your ideas like they matter, not like he's humoring someone less important. The observation was accurate and insightful in ways that reminded her why she trusted her brother's judgment about people and situations. Min-jae had indeed changed, not just in circumstances, but in fundamental approach to relationships and responsibilities. His proposal treated her as equal partner rather than beneficiary of his charitable impulses, recognizing her expertise and experience as valuable contributions rather than obstacles to overcome. 2 weeks later, they signed partnership agreements that established the Seoul Immigrant Artisan Academy with shared ownership, collaborative decision-making, and profit distribution that reflected actual contributions rather than initial financial investment. The legal documents included provisions protecting the Academy's mission from future changes that might compromise service to immigrant communities, ensuring that success couldn't be corrupted into something that forgot its founding principles. The first workshop sessions began in early autumn, with 12 students representing 6 countries and skill levels ranging from absolute beginners to experienced seamsters seeking to understand Seoul's fashion markets and customer expectations. Amara taught restoration techniques, while Min-jae handled business development and customer relations, their different strengths complementing rather than competing as they built something larger than either could have accomplished alone. Watching their students gain confidence and competence as weeks progressed provided satisfaction that transcended personal success, connecting to the deeper purposes that had driven both their decisions throughout months of challenge and change. Mrs. Chun, a grandmother from Taiwan who had followed her daughter's family to Seoul, discovered talent for embroidery that soon attracted customers willing to pay premium prices for hand-finished details on expensive garments. David, a young man from Nigeria who reminded Amara painfully of her father, mastered pattern-making with the precision that suggested engineering background combined with artistic sensitivity. Each graduate who established successful business represented victory not just for individual determination, but for community support systems that enabled newcomers to contribute rather than simply survive in foreign environments. The Academy's success attracted attention from government officials interested in replicating the model, business leaders seeking to understand immigrant entrepreneurship, and other community organizations working to support refugee and immigrant populations. 6 months after opening, they celebrated the Academy's first wedding when 2 students who had met during tailoring classes decided to combine their individual businesses into family enterprise. The ceremony took place in the main workshop space, surrounded by fabric and sewing machines that represented shared dreams and collective achievements. Amara realized, during speeches that honored both tradition and innovation, that they had created exactly the kind of community her grandmother had envisioned. Kimmy served as witness when Amara and Min-jae exchanged vows later that spring, their wedding deliberately simple and focused on commitment rather than ceremony. They spoke about building futures that honored the past without being imprisoned by it, about choosing love that grew from respect rather than obligation, about partnership that strengthened community rather than serving only individual desires. The basement shop became Academy Archive, preserving records of their first meeting and documentation of transformation that had brought them from wounded strangers to partners in enterprise that served purposes larger than romance or personal success. Sometimes, during quiet moments between Academy sessions, they would visit that small space and remember how accident and kindness had created connections strong enough to survive revelation, betrayal, sacrifice, and redemption. Their story might have started with blood on expensive fabric and ended with justice served through tremendous personal cost. But the real victory lived in ordinary moments of teaching immigrants to support themselves with dignity, watching students build businesses that honored both heritage and adaptation, creating systems that proved individual success could strengthen rather than compromise community welfare. What do you think about stories like this one, where love grows from justice rather than just attraction? Have you ever had to choose between what felt good and what felt right? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about whether you believe people can really change and build something beautiful from broken foundations. On the Academy's second anniversary, Amara stood in the workshop space during evening hours when golden light slanted through tall windows and cast long shadows across cutting tables where tomorrow's lessons would unfold. Around her, evidence of collective achievement filled every corner with bolts of fabric, finished garments waiting for customer pickup, and photographs documenting graduations that represented new chapters for families building better futures in foreign soil. Minjae emerged from the office where he had been reviewing applications from their waiting list, which now extended 6 months into the future as word spread about Academy graduates' success rates and community support systems. His smile carried the quiet satisfaction of someone whose life measured value through service rather than accumulation, whose identity rested on contribution rather than inheritance. Together, they had proven that some foundations, however damaged by truth and circumstance, could be rebuilt strong enough to support structures more beautiful and lasting than anything they might have constructed from easier materials. Love built on justice, community grown from individual courage, success measured by collective prosperity rather than personal achievement. In the end, the best patterns were often created from the most unlikely combinations of different threads, woven together by hands that understood both the fragility and strength that came from choosing purpose over comfort, service over safety, connection over protection. And sometimes, if the work was done with sufficient patience and skill, the result could be something beautiful enough to last for generations.